Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Fiber Broadband Association's Five for Breakfast. We're now in our seventh episode of 2025. Before we kick off, I'd like to thank Wesco, the platinum sponsor for Five for Breakfast. Yesterday was the Fiber Broadband Association's first regional Fiber Connect workshop in San Antonio for 2025. We had record attendance as Texas will be by far the largest recipient of BEAD infrastructure funding with $3.3 billion. As of June last summer, we estimated that about nearly 6% of the homes in Texas are either unserved or underserved. And during yesterday's Fiber Connect workshop, we heard from the Federal Reserve on the economic outlook for Texas, from the Governor's Broadband Development Council and the Texas Broadband Development Office. There are also sessions on permitting and case studies in how underserved communities in Texas have got fiber. It's just amazing lineup of speakers on highly relevant topics. Today, the Fiber Broadband Association's Policy Committee is in Austin, Texas, where we're meeting with the state legislature. We look forward to some very productive discussions on how we can work together to ensure that we can deliver fiber to every home and community in the state. Our next Fiber Connect workshop is coming up on March 25th in Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love. And then we'll be our Fiber Day on the Hill this year is in April. Then we'll have our big annual conference, Fiber Connect 2025 in Nashville, June 1st to 4th. That is going to be absolutely amazing with over 5,000 people. We'll be in Anchorage in July, Toronto in August, Spokane in September, Scottsdale in October, Kansas City in November, and then we'll have our premier member meeting in Palm Springs, December 8th and 9th. And that brings us today's Five for Breakfast with former FCC Chairman Ajit Pai, partner at Searchlight Capital. They'll be discussing broadband priorities in the new administration, expanding access, speed, and equity. Before I formally introduce today's guest, I'd like to introduce David Norris from our team, who's going to walk us through some housekeeping items.
Thank you very much, Gary, and thank you for joining us this morning. We appreciate it. Before I go over a few logistics, we'd like to once again thank our platinum sponsor, Fiber for Breakfast, Wesco. Now, please keep in mind all participants are in listen-only mode today. However, if you have a question, please type it into the question box located within the control panel on the side of your screen, and we will get to those questions when we host the Q&A session with our panelists at the end of today's presentation. This presentation is also being recorded and will be available on FBA's website within 24 to 48 hours, and you can find that recording in the Events tab under the Fiber for Breakfast drop-down option. Finally, at the conclusion of today's presentation, you'll be prompted to complete a brief feedback survey. We appreciate your input, so if you could take a moment to do so, that would be great. With that, I will hand things back over to Gary to get us started. Gary?
Thanks, David, and good morning. I'm Gary Bolton, the President and CEO of the Fiber Broadband Association. Last week on Five for Breakfast, our guest was Peter Supino, Wall Street Senior Analyst and Managing Director for Wolfe Research, who discussed the broadband market outlook, key trends. Peter walked us through his thoughts and predictions on broadband subscriber growth and saturation, and why ISPs win where they have fiber, and his views on the market consolidation in the coming years. If you missed last week's session, you can go to our website and watch the replay. Today in Five for Breakfast, our guest is former FCC Chairman Ajit Pai, partner at Searchlight Capital, who's going to be discussing broadband priorities in the new administration, expanding access, speed, and equity. Prior to joining Searchlight in 2021, Ajit was the chairman of the FCC, which he led from 2017 to 2021. During his tenure as chairman, he implemented major initiatives to help close the digital divide, advance U.S. leadership in 5G, Open RAN, Wi-Fi 6, and other wireless technologies, promote innovation, protect consumers, public safety, and national security, and make the agency itself more open, transparent, and data-driven. Mr. Pai first joined the FCC as commissioner in 2012. Before becoming a commissioner, he served in various positions in increasing responsibilities at the FCC, U.S. Department of Justice, the U.S. Senate, and previously he was a partner at Jenner & Block and served as in-house counsel at Verizon. Mr. Pai serves on various portfolio company boards, and he received his AB with, is that AB or BA? With honors from Harvard University and a JD from the University of Chicago Law School. So welcome, Chairman Pai, and for our audience, please type in your questions as we go and work them into our discussion. With that, let's get things kicked off. So let's start with your role leading the FCC during the last Trump administration, what would you say were your greatest achievements?
Well, first, Gary, thanks so much to you and the Fiber Broadband Association for inviting me to participate. It's been a pleasure working with you over the years and culminating this conversation today. It's a nice capstone to our joint efforts in these vineyards. Working at the FCC was a tremendous honor. We were sprinting from day one until our last day and got a lot across the finish line that I'm really proud of. But I suppose the thing that I'm most proud of is the work we took to help close the digital divide, to massively increase the incentive to invest in high quality infrastructure and fiber broadband infrastructure in particular. If you look at my various statements and speeches over the years, you'll see peppered into them on occasion references to the Fiber Broadband Association's reports detailing how much fiber was being deployed, and that we were consistently setting records in 2019, 2020, 2021. And to me, that was a good marker of the efforts that we were taking to ensure that every American has access, not just to broadband, but to best in class broadband, so that by the end of our time, and certainly going forward, our hope was that no American would be left in a relative slow lane compared to some of the more urban brethren in particular. So I'm really proud of the initiatives that we took to help close that digital divide, small and large. The other things you mentioned, 5G, Wi-Fi, making the agency more transparent, and national security and public safety. It's hard to pick among your children, so to speak, but it really, that closing that digital divide was so important, especially since at the end of my tenure, we went directly into the COVID pandemic when broadband networks really stood the test, and nobody was sure going into it that they would. And so to me, it was vindication that we had our eye on the right prize.
Yeah, and actually, the building out the critical fiber infrastructure really kind of leverages, national security, wireless infrastructure, 5G, and also, Wi-Fi and so forth. So it's all kind of builds on the fiber as the foundation. So we really, appreciate your leadership during your long tenure at the FCC and in your leadership at the FCC. So as you were leaving, that was a challenge because you had to get RDOF out really quick as the days were ticking down to, the next administration. Um, Given what you know now, what might have you done different with RDOF?
It's a good question. So I think several points. Number one, had we known that there would be a number of public funding vehicles coming behind it, including the $42 billion for BEAD, the Capital Projects Fund, and other legislative vehicles like that, we obviously would have structured it differently. Our thought was that this was the only certain funding stream that we could think of. And so we had to structure that over the decade to come, a 10-year program, of course. And the second thing is just the political realities. I knew from the outset, because they told me that two of my colleagues were going to be automatic no's on whatever I proposed. And so, I had to get 3 votes, and just a reality of negotiation was that I had to broaden the program beyond what I wanted to focus it on. And so that ultimately ended up in the program that was structured as it was. And so we obviously opened it up to basically any technology. And we also had to structure the program in such a way to incentivize or at least allow participation from those who might be looking to build beyond their traditional footprints or even states. And so we obviously would have structured things differently, encouraged more. And these are things that I now advocate for when I talk to state broadband directors or NTIA or anybody else with broadband equities in the policy space, is to ensure accountability both on the back end but also on the front end. Are these credible operators that you believe will be responsible stewards of the public fisc once they are handed these monies? And so that's one of the things that for the companies we back now at Searchlight, I personally have worked very extensively with some of these companies that nobody will necessarily know the name of on the national stage, but nonetheless, these are the fiber providers who are really focused on closing that digital divide. They're the foot soldiers of the broadband revolution in a lot of these rural areas. And so those are the types of folks that we really want to encourage to participate in, RDOF back then, BEAD now, and any other programs like them.
Well, you have a very unique perspective because you've served as a regulator and now you're in the private sector. So as a partner at Searchlight, how does your firm view fiber from an investment perspective?
We are very bullish on fiber. At the beginning of my tenure at Searchlight back in 2021, we did a very deep dive. We are not an investment firm that sees the hot, shiny new object out there and seizes it. We really do what we call thematic investing, where before allocating capital from that is given to us by our LPs, we really sit down and think, okay, what is our thesis around this particular theme in the sector? And when it comes to telecom, we studied all the technologies, all the different markets, and what we thought was that the one consistent theme in the consumer broadband experience since the dawn of the commercial internet in the 1990s is that they're always consuming more bandwidth, and that applications and services are going to scale accordingly to consume more bandwidth. Moreover, what we thought was that there were starting to emerge at the time, and certainly we see it now too, the need for more symmetric capabilities, things like telehealth or gaming, or even just doing high quality video calls and things like that. That was going to require more symmetric capabilities, and especially as fiber penetrated, or as broadband penetrated more into rural areas, you could see things like precision agriculture requiring very high capacity upload, not just download. And so to us, at least, as we thought about the technologies that were capable of doing that, fiber seemed to be the best technology. And moreover, we saw from some of our portfolio companies that were overbuilding themselves with fiber. And here I'm thinking of Ziply in the Pacific Northwest and Consolidated, which is in a number of states, but predominantly the Northeast. In those areas where we had copper infrastructure that we inherited and were overbuilding it with fiber, we saw tremendous consumer response. The penetration rates that we had underwritten, for example, were exceeded far in front of the benchmarks. And I think that indicated that there's something here that consumers really like about fiber and the gigabit product in particular, even if they might not consume a gigabit or necessarily know all of the things that a gigabit connection could enable them to do. It's something they found very attractive because it gave them the sense of reliability, capacity, and obviously we encourage our companies to do it at a price point that's competitive with some of the others in the market. And so all of which is to say at Searchlight, we are believers in fiber in particular markets, and we're now doing that in rural areas. As I mentioned, we have companies in Virginia, Arizona, and Indiana where I helped spearhead some of those investments. And these are companies that are just really doing some exciting things in small towns, and I guess you might say exurbs in some cases, building fiber and making the business case work, thanks in part to our equity capital and other financial instruments we're able to raise for them. And it's super exciting to see the look on the faces of some of our customers, our company's customers, and I've met some of them, when they get a fiber connection. It's almost the sense of we've arrived. We're no longer in this subordinated slow lane when it comes to the digital economy. And obviously we are looking to do well through these investments, but more importantly, we're looking to do good. And we do feel like fiber enables us to say we've done both.
Yeah, you mentioned Ziply. So as a regulator, we saw the CRTC unbundle fiber in Canada. Was that one of the kind of encouraged Bell Canada to start looking across the border to see some investments in the U.S. or what's your thought on that?
Yeah, the Canadian regulatory landscape is obviously different. You mentioned one of the key points of difference. I think for us, and obviously Bell Canada should speak for itself, but I think what we found was that we had created in Ziply a really attractive asset in that we had best-in-class infrastructure, we knew how to compete, and we were offering these services at a price point that was really attractive and gave the new buyer tremendous opportunities for growth. And Ziply now is still in the process of finishing the overbuild of itself. It's looking to expand in other parts of Oregon, Washington, Idaho, Montana. And I think that what Bell Canada saw is what we saw, is that there's a tremendous opportunity for growth in some of these markets in the Northwest, where you have people who are willing to sign up for and pay for high quality broadband. They are looking for an alternative in some cases where the incumbent might not be as agile as they would like. And it's almost like the field of dreams. If you build it, they will come. And so to build it, of course, requires a substantial infusion of capital. And that's something that Bell Canada certainly brings to the table. And I think also the U.S. market having more, generally speaking, of course, every state is different, but generally having a more deregulatory approach is something that allowed Bell Canada to pencil out return on invested capital that would be relatively attractive to them.
So, one of the things that, with the I guess policymakers, they like to use speed as a proxy for broadband, right? And during the Connected America funds, we were at was 4.1 and 10.1 and 25.3. We had all these different speeds, which encouraged regional providers to invest in DSL technology which then resulted in their market failure, and that they had to restructure. And now we see them investing in fiber and becoming very, very creative, like Frontier now with their merger with Verizon and so forth. Can you, now that we have the, kind of the advantage of being able to look back in time, is it a mistake to use speed as a proxy versus, when we see like RUS and others have really looked at this investment more as critical infrastructure rather than just, how do we get someone minimum speeds?
Yeah, it's fun. That's a great question, and it is funny now. Having spent 4 years in the private sector,
Yeah.
I sometimes smile looking back at some of the fiercely debated topics at the FCC during my tenure. One of which, of course, was the speed thresholds, and I'm old enough to remember when it was it 268 kilobits way back 20 years ago, and you're then increasing it to 25 over 3. And now it should be 100 over 20. Should be gigabit. Not to me, a lot of that is just noise. From now, what I can say with some confidence is that I think that policymakers should view it from the consumer perspective. Where is the consumer now, and where is the consumer going to be in 5 years, 10 years, 25 years? And this is something I did say when I was at the FCC, to my partial credit. But so I think, in a sense, it doesn't really matter what the speed threshold is, as is pronounced by a particular majority of the FCC in Washington or by a lawmaker. What really matters is where the puck is going from a consumer perspective. And that's part of the reason why we are so bullish at Searchlight, at least, on fiber. Because fiber now, you have all of these trends that are serving as tailwinds. One is, of course, the consumer expectation, which we've discussed. Another one is the rise of an entire pocket of private capital, infrastructure capital, that has a lower rate of return expectation, also a much longer time horizon. These aren't 3 to 5 year private equity investments. These are more 7 to 10 years and beyond investments. So very relatively longer term investments that people are looking for. And on top of that, you have a sense that this is enduring infrastructure that reduces substantially the cost that's involved on an OpEx from an OpEx perspective. You don't have to have a lot of truck rolls. You can have visibility directly into the network a lot easier than you would with, say, a DSL network or even an HFC network, things like that. And so I think that people have come around to viewing this as sort of core infrastructure, which is not how they viewed broadband at all. I'd say from a PE perspective, at least 10, 20 years ago. And so all of those things are combining, I think. And you're seeing that now. You mentioned some of the deals, Verizon Frontier, of course, Ziply Bell Canada. People are recognizing that there's something about fiber that gives it a very long-lived infrastructure lifetime. And that's something that's very attractive, not just from an investment perspective, but importantly from a consumer perspective. This is infrastructure that consumers know. I won't say future-proof, because nothing is future-proof. If we've learned anything, we know that technology is always racing ahead. But I do think it is an extremely long-lived asset that is somewhat akin to the railroads of the 19th century and certainly the telephone networks of the 20th century. This is infrastructure that people want and expect to be there when they need it. And that's part of the reason why we think there are a lot of very good secular tailwinds for fiber.
Well, absolutely. I mean, twisted pair, and we had 5 nines of reliability for the old PSTN, and then when data overtook voice as really the main application, now fiber is the critical infrastructure for the next century. So what can you tell us about your role on the Trump transition team, and kind of and where do you see things going?
Yeah, well, I can't say a lot. It's sort of like Fight Club, I suppose, right? I can't. The first rule is not to disclose too much. But what I will say is that the Trump campaign, the transition team, and now, of course, the administration is singularly focused on making sure that we have the framework in place from a policy perspective to build things in America. Getting rid of some of the regulatory obstacles that are out there, making sure that people have the maximum incentive to raise and invest capital, making sure that work crews are put back to work, building these high quality networks across the country. And to the extent that my advice was solicited, that's the number one thing I encourage them to think about is, how do we make sure that our goal of getting every American connected who wants a high quality connection can happen. Broadband doesn't fall from trees, as you know better than anybody. And so that's what the campaign, what the transition team and the administration, I think, are going to be focused on is, let's get rid of some of the rules in Washington that are standing in the way of work crews putting fiber and other high quality technologies into the ground and into the air in some cases.
Yeah, no, I was really excited. I thought that John Stankey of AT&T did a great job after the election to demonstrate where they thought the right investment was for them, and getting, targeted 50 million homes by the end of 2029, and how it advanced their business case, and how it's able to attach their wireless and other reduce their OpEx, and create jobs. So one of the things I'm confused about, and we're really excited about the new administration. We're really excited about, really the focus on getting things deployed, make things happen faster, lighter regulatory environment, all the good things that are going to come with this new administration. But during, Howard Lutnick's Senate hearings, there's a lot of concern that was voiced, was about, NTI's priority on fiber, especially when it comes to extremely high costs. As an investor, you guys see fiber as very accretive, and why does there seem to be a gap between the private sector and what the private sector is willing to spend their money on, and what policymakers think is a good investment for taxpayers?
Yeah, and we'll get to that in a second, but I do want to piggyback off something you said about John Stankey's remarks, which I think were spot on. But it was also critically paired with AT&T's announcement that they really want to start retiring some of this aging infrastructure that's in place, and they hope that the new FCC, led by Brendan Carr, of course, as the new chairman, will help them do that. And I think those two things are such important halves of the coin. And I was screaming this from the rooftops when I was a commissioner back in 2012, 2013. Yeah. Every dollar that is invested in copper, by definition, cannot be invested in fiber. And so to the extent that we can allow companies like AT&T, anybody else in this space with aging infrastructure, to refocus its investments, to get capital allocation looking to the future as opposed to maintaining the past, that's a good thing, not just for those companies, not just for the industry, but for the American consumer. So spot on point that you made about that.
No, I mean, thanks for bringing that up, because the CEOs of ISPs across our membership saying every dollar they have to spend on copper is a dollar not being spent on fiber, and why are we doing that, right?
And I can tell you at Searchlight, I have a foot in both camps. Ziply Consolidated, of course, with more, have inherited more copper-based TDM networks. And so I see how difficult it is for them in some of these cases. But then on the other side, I see the opportunities for some of our fiber-only, fiber-first companies, like the ones I mentioned. And for them, they don't have to worry about legacy IT systems and OSS, BSS transition, and how do you deal with the customer service requests. How do you persuade them to migrate from copper to fiber? All those things just melt away when you're starting with fiber. So the future is out there if policymakers can catch up to where the consumer and where these companies want to go from a technological perspective.
Even further is I'm going to have the president of Hawaiian Tel on in a couple of weeks. And, by their copper retirement, they really accelerated their zero carbon footprint priorities. When you get rid of all the OpEx and all the, the carbon footprint that from a copper network, you're able to really get to a more sustainable network. So anyway, let's get into, so why is there a gap between, what the private investors are putting their capital in versus what policymakers think is good for the, Americans or taxpayer investment?
Yeah, so I think part of the gap is due to BEAD's implementation in this case, and you've heard this repeatedly, not just from policymakers, but just from average people. Why was this money allocated, $42 billion in 2021, and still not a single household has been connected with broadband? And for all of the complaints about RDOF, at least you can say that all closing in on 1 million consuming households, I should say, have been connected with broadband today compared to when RDOF started, relative to BEAD, where 4 years later, not a single shovel has hit the ground. And so I think there's a frustration between the promise of BEAD as was enunciated back in 2021 and the reality of implementation in 2025, which is that cumbersome processes and regulatory requirements and whatever other factors people might identify have stood in the way of BEAD funding getting out there. And from a private perspective as well, look, we actually believe what we saw in the terms of the statute and the notice of funding opportunity that, okay, this is going to be the timeline. And so we organized our capital allocation activities accordingly. And so it honestly was a surprise to us that at the end of 2024, you still had states whose volume 2s had not been approved. There's all sorts of regulatory requirements that didn't seem to be specified in the law that seemed to be being maintained in some of these state volume 2s at the NTIA's request, et cetera. And so all of which is to say that I think that what you saw hearing was a little bit of a disjunction between that has been created because of this gap in expectations. I thought the Secretary Designate did a masterful job enunciating the basic point that everybody, not just people in our space, but everybody expects. Government should get the benefit of the bargain. And the bargain was that we will allocate this $42 billion in public spending, and we will do it in an efficient way that gets consumers connected to broadband. And I obviously don't want to read too much into what the questions were, what the answers were, but I think that basic principle is so important. Let's get rid of some of the regulatory overhang that stands in the way of these funds being distributed. Make sure that that we as Americans are seeing these monies being spent wisely, and let's just get people connected. And that's something I think that most people, Republican and Democrat, would agree with. There's no Republican or Democrat when it comes to getting Americans in these rural areas, unserved and underserved areas, connected with high quality broadband.
Well, I mean, we are just thrilled with the speed of getting the secretary in place and the assistant secretary in place because, we got to accelerate this program, and we know the new administration wants to accelerate it. So we want to minimize the review period and, to try to get the revisions to streamline and accelerate the whole program because, these Americans, they're the ones that are, kind of getting the short end of the stick right now. And also, we've had the supply side have spent billions and billions to move manufacturing in the U.S., to have U.S. jobs, and we can't allow anything to stall that's going to, where they're going to have to furlough workers and, the factory is going to be quiet waiting for, the government to figure out, unwind what was done and try to redo the program. So we're greatly appreciative of the administration's efforts to be very quick, do the right things, but do it as quickly as possible.
Yeah, and the other thing to think about is that I know we've been talking mainly about residential broadband, fiber in particular, but I think that one of the things that is really important is that all of these things are interconnected. So, for example, all of the 5G and next generation wireless technology that's being deployed will require fiber connections for backhaul. All of these massive data centers that are being built across the country that are going to require fiber connectivity, to enable the transmission and receipt of data. All of that's going to require fiber. And so building out fiber through BEAD or whatever program to these residences is not simply limited to connecting an individual consumer. I think it's a matter of just economic growth and technological innovation. Fiber is almost like the matrix if you think about it. It's everywhere. It's even here in this very room. You can see it when you turn on your television or when you pay your taxes. It's sort of, I don't want to overstate its ubiquity, of course, but all of which is to say that fiber, in a sense, is a backbone for all these different technologies. And so I think there's been, in some cases, the false dichotomy presented between fiber on one hand and every other technology on the other hand. To me, it's all part of a really textured, high-quality broadband network that just gets bits from point A to point B in the most efficient way. And my hope is, anyway, that that's how policymakers will see it going forward.
Well, exactly. I mean, you get the question of why would you spend 100,000 pulling fiber to a house that's only worth 150,000? Well, because you're building out the middle mile infrastructure that allows you to put more houses in there, and it's going to amortize that investment over more houses. And what we saw in Northeast Louisiana is when Beneath and Thomas were able to get fiber to Northeast Louisiana, now Meta's putting an AI data center in there. And so you're creating all kinds of economic development. So you're not just pulling fiber to one house, but you're really enabling the economic growth of a rural, low density area to really be able to, just like the way a railroad would come to a town and then all of a sudden spur economic activity in that community. So, hey, one last question, because I know that, as an investor, you have a really good insight on this, but, you mentioned fiber is, more than just broadband, but what are the applications you're seeing that really fiber enables?
Oh, it's tremendous. There are a lot of them. So certainly AI is the thing that we've been thinking about a lot. And we're looking at a number of companies in the AI space that are leveraging high capacity bandwidth in order to very quickly and seamlessly connect a consumer to your particular data center or other place where that query can be processed and delivered. And so we're looking a lot at some of the verticals in the AI space. And another one, and we haven't yet found the killer company or the killer app, but we're really thinking a lot about telehealth, telemedicine, some of those verticals, which I think are very exciting. And it just seems to fit the need for reducing costs in the healthcare system, the closure of hospitals and other healthcare facilities, particularly in rural areas, the advancement of technologies like 5G, which I mentioned, and Wi-Fi and others that are going to require fiber, to backhaul a lot of that traffic. So all of these things are kind of pointing to, I think, some really interesting breakthroughs in telehealth, and so we're looking at that as well. I mentioned data centers, where we've become very focused, and associated digital infrastructure like towers, which I think are going to require a lot of fiber to be able to connect with backhaul. And so the future is bright, and that's part of the reason why I say, I think that unfortunately in some Washington debates there is a lot of oppositional commentary about these technologies, and I see it as all part of a really exciting time to innovate in the United States. And regardless of the technology, fixed wireless, satellite, fiber, let's let all of them compete fairly and let the consumer and essentially drive business decisions through the aggregated wisdom that they show us. And I'm confident that if that happens, we'll be in a really strong position as a country going forward.
Well, Chairman Pai, I think I'm going to take the replay of this and listen into it every morning when I get up to get totally pumped up for the day, because I'm so excited about the future. And thanks for all your great leadership at the FCC, the transition with the new administration, and as an investor in our industry. So thank you for everything you do. And I want to thank everybody for joining us today. We're going to get back together next Wednesday with Peter Cease, who's going to talk about AI, how AI accelerates fiber network value. So you're not going to want to miss this. This is going to be a great talk. So again, Chairman Pai, thanks again, and we'll look forward to seeing you soon.
Thanks so much. Appreciate it.
All right, hang on a minute, Ajit, if you don't mind.
Okay.
David, are we good?